After moving to a new house, the 7-year-old girl went through a worrying experience. Her cat disappeared. She was just a child, not a cat expert, and didn't even know that many times those rascals do this. They try to hide when they're in a new, unfamiliar environment. It's just a strategy to give themselves time and then explore the new things at their own pace. And that's how it was that day, but that was a long time ago. I don't even know if it was summer or if it was cold. What I do know is the little girl with red hair and expressive green eyes first walked around the property, then went out to the street looking for her pet and calling his name. Then, in a very independent and proactive way, she ventured further, asking the neighbors if anyone had seen her colorful pet, describing him as furry and asking for help to find him. That's how she met a certain girl from the neighborhood, the one who would become her inseparable childhood companion and her best friend in adolescence. And little did they know what fate had in store to unite them forever. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome, everyone. And I started today's episode by narrating the moment when Michelle Yvette Avila met Karen Severson. That moment stayed in both of their memories, okay? These events happened around the year 1975 when Michelle was called Missy by her family and friends. When life was much less complicated and kids weren't into technology. So, the girls there who lived in Arleta, which is an immigrant neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, really liked it. They liked playing in the street, riding bikes, staying outside. Whether it was with dolls or board games, it didn't matter. Sometimes there were sleepovers and joyful birthday parties that alternated between the Avila and Severson families' houses. They made the most of the freedom that existed back then, when the biggest fear was being grounded, stuck in their room by their parents' decision after some disobedience. I would even say that today that wouldn't be a punishment. Actually, taking that away would be the punishment, right? Either way, both girls back then, Missy and Karen, had loving families who ended up becoming connected through the friendship of their children. As often happens, it's not so much that much later, everyone would remember the important role that Karen played with Irene, Missy's mother, when the girl disappeared. But we'll revisit that memory in a moment. Before we continue, I already asked for your like, a comment, or even just an emoji. Consider becoming a member here on the channel. It helps me a lot. Check your subscription so you don't miss any episodes. Deal? The friendship between Missy and Karen lasted many years, but it couldn't withstand the changes brought on by their entry into adolescence and high school. That's right. The two best friends in the world started to drift apart when they entered San Fernando High School in the San Fernando Valley. Actually, for us here in Brazil, this transition into adolescence doesn't seem as shocking as what American teenagers go through. At least that's what we see in Hollywood movies, isn't that right? At 16, they get their driver's license and get ready to leave home, going to college, where they live and take charge of their own lives in different ways. Isn't that right? Anyway, they start working really early. It's a reality, a culture that's different from ours. Karen, at just 14 years old, ended up getting pregnant and temporarily left this part of her life, school. She did this to take responsibility for the baby. This deeply impacted the lives of both friends. Karen reported that she asked Missy to visit her, since she needed to stay home with the child. But Missy always seemed to have other plans, leaving Karen more and more aside. A few months later, with the help of her mother and grandmother, Karen managed to return to her studies. But the experience of becoming a mother so early left clear emotional scars. 3 years later, in 1985, when they were both 17 years old, that distance between them was already impossible to ignore. Missy was one of the most popular girls in school, and that bothered a lot of people, especially Karen, her childhood best friend. For Karen, it was a double blow. Missy being much more popular than her, and Missy having fun with boys instead of socializing with Karen. At that time, around 1985, the girls were 17 years old. And it seems that things got a little out of control. When Karen's jealousy led her to slander Missy, A pretty serious accusation. Anywhere and any time, Karen spread it to the whole community. Missy was sleeping with several boys. And as a consequence of that lie, she was beaten up by a group of girls who were the girlfriends of the boys who were supposedly involved with Missy. It's a bit confusing, but I think you can understand, right? I don't know about you, but it seems like this was a police matter to file a report, even a lawsuit for defamation or something like that, maybe even a claim for damages and a restraining order, and also expulsion from school. Maybe it was supposed to be an episode at the very least taken more seriously, but there's no record of any of that. At the very least, their friendship should have ended, disappeared. But just like in a very dramatic Mexican soap opera, other chapters followed. One of them involved a brief relationship of a few weeks between Missy and a boy named Randy. The relationship wasn't going well because of Randy's behavior. He was really into parties and wasn't committed to his relationship with Missy. When their relationship ended, life moved on, but it seems it moved a little too quickly for Randy. He soon got involved with someone else. Guess who? Karen. And they moved in together in a small apartment. Given this context, which could cause a lot of friction and confusion, Karen started gossiping. She told Missy's mother, told Mrs. Irene that Randy was harassing Missy because she was making things easier by giving attention to her ex. But the truth is that the perception was that the boy was kind of annoying and that he was chasing after Missy, even though she had no interest in getting back with him. But the damage was already done. Given all this confusion and the impossibility of trusting Randy, Karen was advised to end the relationship with the boy. Instead of doing that, she got mad at Missy. It's all very bizarre, with no real ending, and a lot of loose ends that could turn into big nightmares, right? Despite all that, the relationship was never officially broken off. It was a friendship marked by drifting apart, getting close again, and resentments building up over the years. And do you remember that Missy was popular and maybe considered prettier and more interesting than her rival? Yeah, and we also can't forget that these were teenage relationships that shouldn't be taken so seriously, right? But unfortunately, no one thought that way. These conflicts were getting out of control because they started with false accusations, intrigue, arguments, and then escalated. This happened one day, when the girls Missy and Karen were in a park in the neighborhood where they lived. I just can't say if this meeting was a coincidence or if they actually arrived there together. The thing is, they had another argument, but this time it turned into a physical fight. When Karen threatened Missy with a broken beer bottle, pushed her friend, and slapped her in the face, and a fight with a broken bottle threat. It almost sounds like something a drunk person or a violent criminal would do, doesn't it? But it really was that level of violence between two teenagers, and remember, this was about 40 years ago. But the story doesn't end there. After that episode, the two of them went a while without direct contact. Their relationship seemed to have reached its limit. Finally, until weeks after that, something happened that changed everything. People who followed this case remember that on October 1st, 1985, a Tuesday, Missy told her mother that she was going out with a friend from school, a girl supposedly named Laura Doyle, who was known to her, so everything seemed fine. Laura drove by Missy's house and they left together. And that was the last time Mrs. Irene saw her daughter alive. Missy was taking a long time to come back. It had been about 4 hours since she left, quite a long time, right? Then, suddenly, Laura herself called Missy's house and asked to speak with her. At that moment, a warning light went off in Mrs. Irene's mind. Her mother thought this call was really strange because the girls had gone out together and Missy hadn't come back yet. And the rest of Laura's story was that Missy had stayed behind talking to 3 guys at a gas station, boys who were in a blue Camaro after filling up their own car. So Laura looked for Missy, but she was no longer in the same place where the blue Camaro had been parked. In other words, for all intents and purposes, Missy had switched rides and left with those three guys, but there was no name, description, or license plate. Only these vague pieces of information were given to the police when they got involved in the mysterious disappearance case. Because Missy didn't have a history of running away, family problems, a secret boyfriend, no drug issues, nothing like that, but she did have a history with a childhood friend, right? But nothing that, at that moment, in the eyes of the detectives, would justify the theory of a voluntary disappearance. Especially because before she disappeared, Missy went out casually with a friend, which means she was probably prevented from returning home. Someone evil was probably involved in this. Maybe a kidnapping, a serial killer, an accident, nobody knew. Unfortunately, on October 4th, about 72 hours after she disappeared, Missy was found. But not in the way her parents and friends had hoped. She was dead, lying face down in a creek at Big Tujunga Creek, inside the Angeles National Forest. The 17-year-old girl had been held with her face submerged in about 6 inches of water. It was a homicide, a scene of terrifying violence because there was a tree trunk on top of the body. And her hair, which was a trademark of her presence and reached down to her waist, had been almost completely shaved off. A very important element from the perspective of forensic psychology, isn't it? The crime caused a stir in the community, at the school, and among those who knew and loved the girl, including her friends. Both Karen and Laura, in fact, attended Missy's funeral and were emotional. Karen, despite the fights in recent times, still held the status of best friend. She was especially supportive of the family's pain, sending a condolence card to Missy's family, along with $20, a symbolic amount to help with the burial expenses. This is something very common in the United States, but here comes the part that I find most surprising in this story, which was the fact that Karen temporarily moved into her deceased friend's house to show her support and love. She even slept in Missy's bed and wore her deceased friend's clothes. In this way, she was acting as a substitute daughter. To Mrs. Irene, Karen seemed obsessed with the crime. She visited Missy's grave several times a week, also covered her bedroom walls with photos of Missy, newspaper clippings about the case, and repeatedly visited Big Tujunga Creek. That's right, exactly where her friend's body had been found. At one point, she told Irene, the grieving mother, that she saw Missy's ghost. Check this out. In this case, we don't know the reason for such police incompetence, such a lack of answers. But the case remained at a standstill until July 26, 1988, almost 3 years after the crime. Were there no suspects, no evidence? Anyway, many people remember that day in 1988 when, apparently out of nowhere, a young woman named Eva Chirumbolo, who hadn't even shown up here before, traveled about 100 kilometers from her home to a police station and gave a bizarre account.
I wish that I had the courage and the strength to say, hey, this is enough, and to see what they were doing and stop it. I don't know why I didn't. I know I was only 17, but if I could change it, I think I would do it now.
Eva is this young woman here who on that day told the police the facts that explained the murder of Michelle, or Missy, Avila. And the details are still shocking today. After so many years and after hearing so many similar stories, they're still shocking. She knew everything because one day, years before, 2 classmates had told her what happened. But, just like in a crime movie script, without any creativity, I would say, when the criminals are the characters already included in the story from the very beginning. Missy's killers were her 2 supposed friends, Karen Severson, the neighbor and childhood companion, and Laura Doyle, who invited her out and offered her a ride, the last one of her life. You remember well, right? It was Laura who went to Missy's house, picked her up, went out, went for a drive, and supposedly Karen was with them. Later on that trip where 3 guys in a Camaro supposedly took Missy, yeah, it was those 2 girls. The information about this case focuses a lot on that disappointing truth and not on the technical part of the investigation, okay? So here are some unanswered questions. But what the prosecutors described in 2020 at the trial of the perverse ones, we can say, right, Karen and Laura, looks like what is currently called a crime court. Take a look at when some people feel entitled to arrest, judge, convict, and execute those who break the rules of drug trafficking. For example, in this case, rules that only existed in the minds of these two, right? Because in these cases, aren't violations of constitutional laws involved? Do I need to be clearer in this comparison? Karen and Laura set up a plan, a trap, an ambush for Missy so that she would go there to the Angeles National Forest. There, the two accused the girl of being promiscuous, of Missy having sexual relations with their boyfriends and with other supposed victims. In other words, that Missy, at 17 years old, was a man-eater, and that she had interfered with and ruined many relationships of the girls at the school. For these crimes, Missy was immediately sentenced to death by the two evil classmates. Karen and Laura attacked Missy and held her face down in that puddle of water. 6 inches, and it was enough time for Missy's lungs to fill with water and for her to drown. Even though the creek was really shallow, like I said, after that they put a tree trunk over the corpse, a piece of wood heavy enough to keep the body in that spot, so that, days later, it could be found by possible people passing by while hiking in the park. Yeah, guys, it's hard to believe that envy in a teenager's soul can be so cruel, isn't it? I think we can talk a little about this feeling, right? The envy that has come up here so many times. Competition in adolescence about rivalry between girls regarding popularity among boys. And think about it, guys, in the 80s, you couldn't even count likes, okay? But that's what the relationship problems of former best friends came down to. Well, following the timeline of the case then, a few years had passed since the murder and we arrived. Then, in 1990, when the murderers Karen and Laura were put on trial, at first they were charged with first-degree murder, but they were convicted of second-degree murder. The change happened because the jurors said they were not convinced that the murder was planned and premeditated. So the sentences were light, ranging from a minimum of 15 years to life. In short, guys, Karen Severson was released in December 2011 after serving 21.5 years in prison, while Laura Doyle was released in December 2012 after serving 22 years. Karen didn't waste any time because she needed to be watched and admired. She gave many interviews claiming to be sorry for committing the crime. She also explained that being at Missy's house in 1985 after her disappearance and death was meant to actually support Mrs. Irene, the victim's mother. Because Karen felt somehow morally obligated since she had been both the best friend and also the killer, right? Another goal was to closely follow the investigation and find out firsthand what the police were discovering. And whether she and Laura, the accomplices, were in the detective's sights or not, that seems more truthful. She talked about the enormous burden of carrying the feeling of guilt and keeping this secret between the day of the crime and also Eva's report. She also said that she sought refuge in alcohol and that it was emotionally liberating when the truth came out. But right after getting out of jail, she got a job in telemarketing, and she started promoting an autobiography about the crime, her experience in prison. And she made a deal to produce a movie. The book is called It's My Life, I Live It. It's my life, I lived it. Obviously, Missy's family was outraged by this project and sued Karen in 2015, seeking to prevent her from profiting from Missy's death. In this case, the money should go to the victim's family. The issue received a lot of publicity and sparked discussions. As a result, the state of California passed the Missy Law, requiring publishers and organizations that publish works written by criminals to first contact the victims' families. And that, I think I don't even need to say, is quite interesting in many ways, isn't it? There is a law called the Son of Sam Law, a notoriety for profit law, created to prevent criminals from profiting from the publicity of their crimes, selling their stories to publishers or production companies. This law authorizes the state to confiscate the money that comes from these sales in order to compensate the victims of the criminals. That seems logical and fair, right? But you won't believe that this law was criticized for violating freedom of speech, which is guaranteed by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Can you believe it? The conclusion is that several states adopted this, right, to curb this kind of, I would say, immorality, let's be honest. Freedom of speech, come on, man, what do you mean? Freedom of speech, it's that same conflict, right? Like, we need to fight in every way against these cowardly bastards who murder women, children, defenseless people like that, the elderly. But then when they lock the guy up, he gets just a tiny bit of a sentence and can get out for good behavior. There's an obvious conflict there, right? At least in my layman's mind, there is. Of course, some people might disagree, maybe. Anyway, I remembered this because it seems like that's what's happening, right? Making sure the guy can profit commercially from the crime he committed. Soon this is going to turn into a business, right? Killing someone to write a book makes sense, doesn't it? It's bizarre, actually, a crime story like this about the pettiness of these girls, right? Pure envy, such a rotten feeling. And it makes you think about how the murderer's parents didn't notice the development of their daughter's twisted behavior. Isn't it? Or maybe they noticed and ignored it because anyone who knew about the fights would have seen the presence of abnormal and increasing violence, right? Here, in fact, we can remember the death of Daniela Perez, which led her mother, the writer Gloria Perez, to fight a battle for years, right? And not allow her killers, Danny's killers, to get publicity and profit from exploiting the crime. Because in the mid-90s, while still awaiting trial, Guilherme de Padua, the killer, wrote his version of the events. And he named this work The Story That Brazil Doesn't Know. The book was published by O Escriba Publishing House from Minas Gerais, but the court banned the circulation of the work. In this supposed autobiographical novel, Guilherme argued that he and Daniela Perez had a brief romantic relationship, and that it was Paula Tomas, his wife at the time, who committed the murder motivated by jealousy. Anyway, it was just a memory, but I want to know what you thought about the Miss case. Comment here. For me, if you already knew a story like this, well, here's another one, right? Where the cliché jealousy kills prevailed. Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.